The right to vote is one of the most essential rights in our country. It gives us the right to vote for our leaders instead of them being chosen for us. In the present, every adult in the Philippines is given this essential right, but it wasn't always like this. Today we will look at the history of the right to vote, how it started from a limited right given only to the very few, to a right that most adult Filipinos enjoy. During the pre-colonial era, each island, each group, each settlement had their own way of running things. Some of these settlements were called barangays, and the heads of these barangays were called datu. The datu were their own social class and only married within that class. There were no voting rights in this era because their rules were largely decided by blood and not by choice. When the Spanish arrived in the Philippines in 1521, they found the barangays to be highly organized political units. As they colonized the Philippines, they kept the leadership position of the datus, but reduced their power to essentially become tax collectors. The barangays under their control was organized under a single government. With the colonial government in Manila, the Philippines was divided into provinces, and those provinces were divided into municipal towns or pueblos, and then into barangays, which the Spanish renamed into barrios. They would appoint many of the former datus to become the town mayor or to become head of the barrios. These barrio heads were also known as the cabeza de barangay. For most of the Spanish period, officials were chosen or appointed by the Spanish government. However, during the 1800s, unrest grew within the country. Because of the loss of most of the Spanish colonies in North and South America, the Spanish wanted to make the remaining colonies, including the Philippines, more profitable. This meant industrializing the Philippines. To do this, the Spanish meant to connect the Philippines to the European markets and the global economy. With the opening of European markets to the Philippines comes the arrival of European ideas of liberalism. This exposed the emerging middle class of Filipinos to the ideas of self-rule and government. Many intellectuals and progressive priests called for government reform, but the Spanish resisted their efforts. Many were prosecuted, with the most prominent victims being Fathers Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, also known as Gamburza. However, this changed in 1893 with the issuance of the Maura Municipal Law. This law created municipal tribunals, which they said would administer the communal interests and property of the town. These tribunals were composed of 5 people: 1 captain, 1 chief lieutenant, 1 police lieutenant, 1 lieutenant of fields, and 1 lieutenant of cattle. These 5 positions would be elected by 12 electors. These electors would then be chosen by the provincial governor and the principalia of each town. To be a principalia, you had to be 1, a man who was A, current or former local officials who did not have a bad record, or B, a resident paying 50 pesos as land tax. To compare, in 1890, a wage worker's cedula tax was 2 pesos. Additionally, the 12 electors couldn't be just anyone. 6 had to be former cabezas de barangay, 3 had to be former captains, and the last 3 were from the highest taxpayers of the town. This 12 would then be the ones to elect the 5 members of the municipal tribunal. So even when the Spanish authorities allowed people to vote, it was only limited to very rich men, and even then, they could not vote directly for the positions. They could only vote for the electors, and those electors would be the ones to actually vote for those positions. Given the approval of the provincial governor was needed, this ensured that the only people that would be appointed were those already approved by the Spanish. The Maura Law did not seem to work. Filipinos were not satisfied with these reforms because in 1896, the Philippine Revolution began. One of the reasons they rebelled is because they wanted a government that represented them. Filipino forces fought the Spanish in the Philippines for many years. In May 1898, Emilio Aguinaldo, leader of the Filipino forces, established the dictatorial government. This was the emergency government that existed for a month before being replaced by the revolutionary government, which was itself replaced by the First Philippine Republic, also known as the Malolos Republic. On June 18, 1898, a decree was released that outlined the system of elections. It said whenever and wherever the Spanish forces have been defeated, outstanding citizens of every town shall convene in a big assembly and elect by majority vote the town mayor and the head of every barrio in the town. Citizens were identified as outstanding due to their brightness of mind, character, and goodness, whether they are within the town or in the small villages. Sadly, the decree did not provide us with more specifics, but we can theorize more from the other parts of the decree. They outlined that those elected to be mayor or barrio head should be an outstanding citizen and should be those known to have proven their love for the independence of the country and are at least 21 years old. So from this, we can assume that the voting rights during the Philippine Revolution are limited to those who are 1. An outstanding citizen as defined. Brightness of mind probably include intellectuals like lawyers or doctors. Character and goodness in this case probably include community leaders and other respected members of the local community such as elders and wealthy businessmen. 2. We can also assume that it is limited to those that support the Philippine Revolution. 3. They must be at least 21 years of age. And lastly, 4. We can also assume that voting was limited to men only, as that was the standard for voting at the time. When the time came to elect members of the Malolos Congress in 1899, we can also assume that the same qualifications were used. These voting rights would not stay for long, as the Americans arrived to replace the Spanish. Filipino forces would resist for years, but were eventually forced to surrender. President Aguinaldo would be captured in 1901. His surrender marked the official end of the First Philippine Republic. As the dream of independence was pushed back, the right to vote for their own leaders were also pushed back. As the Americans took over the Philippines, they launched 2 Philippine commissions. The first commission, known as the Sherman Commission, was appointed in 1898. The first commission launched an investigation on the country and gave recommendations to the government. They said that the Philippines was not yet ready for independence but should be given self-rule. This recommendation was carried out by the second commission, known as the Taft Commission. Unlike the first commission, the second can actually pass laws. In 1901, they passed Act No. 82, known as the Municipal Code, which provided for the elections for the municipal presidents and councilors. The law outlined the requirements for voting as the following. 1. They were male persons. 2. They were at least 23 years old, so they pushed for a higher age compared to the Filipinos. 3. They had legal residence where they would vote for at least 6 months before the election. Number 4, they had to be part of one of the following 3 groups. Group A was those that held local office before August 13, 1898, when the Americans took Manila. This included positions like the cabeza de barangay or the municipal captain. Group B was those who own real property to the value of 500 pesos or pay at least 30 pesos in annual taxes. For comparison, the average wage in 1905 was around 40 cents a day. And Group C was those that could speak, read, and write English or Spanish, so Filipino was not included. The law also excluded people who did not pay their taxes, the insane, and those who rebelled or supported the rebels after April 1, 1901, or when Aguinaldo declared allegiance to the U.S. Most importantly, before submitting their ballots, voters were also asked to sign the elector's oath in which they recognize and accept the supreme authority of the United States of America. All of this worked to restrict many Filipinos who were not rich enough to vote or those that did not get an education to speak English or Spanish. In 1907, a new election law was passed. This law provided for the organization of the Philippine Assembly. They were composed of 81 members and were all elected. The requirements to vote mostly remained the same, apart from the fact that they changed the cutoff date from April to May 1, 1901, and the fact that they finally removed the elector's oath. Going forward a few years, Woodrow Wilson became the U.S. President in 1913. He supported the idea of Philippine independence. He pushed for Filipinization of the government, so this means more and more of the government posts were given to Filipinos. These efforts resulted in 1916 with the passage of the Jones Law, or the Philippine Autonomy Act. This act specifically stated the intent to eventually grant Philippine independence. The Philippine Commission was replaced by a mostly elected Senate, and the Assembly was replaced with the House of Representatives. The requirements were adjusted again. The voting age was reduced from 23 to 21. A requirement was added saying that the voter must have lived in the Philippines for 1 year before the election. And lastly, the law now allowed those who could read and write in a native language to vote. This gave more and more male Filipinos who were not fluent in either Western language to have the right to vote. The dream of independence never really died, In the 1930s, Filipinos made great efforts to campaign in the United States for the cause of Philippine independence. In 1934, this resulted with the passing of the Tidings-McDuffie Law in the U.S. Congress. It provided for a 10-year transition period during which the Commonwealth of the Philippines would be established with its own constitution. This constitution was written by a constitutional convention in 1934 and was approved by a nationwide vote or plebiscite in 1935. It created the elected offices of President and Vice President. This new constitution outlined only 4 requirements to be able to vote. 1. That you were a male citizen that was not otherwise disqualified by law, for example, if you committed a crime. 2. That you were at least 21 years old. 3. That you can read and write. And 4. That you lived in the country for at least a year and in the municipality where you will vote for at least 6 months. They finally removed here the property requirements that disqualified many Filipino men. Average working men were given the right to vote. However, women were still excluded from voting, but women fought for it. The Filipinos' fight for the right to vote was a long and tiring one. Some accounts stated that the first bill for women's suffrage or right to vote was in 1906. When the 1935 Constitution was written, the women's right to vote was not permanently included. In its place, the Constitution specified that it would be given if in 2 years a plebiscite was passed affirming women's right to vote. Although delayed for 2 more years, a plebiscite was held in 1937 in which women voted 91% in favor to have the right to vote. The Commonwealth transition period was interrupted in World War II by the invasion of the Japanese. They would conquer the Philippines and establish their own puppet government. They wanted to give the illusion of elections, so when they set up the Second Philippine Republic, it allowed voting if you were at least 18 years old. However, most importantly, you had to be a member of the pro-Japanese Calipapi Party, the only political party allowed. Some Calipapi members did try to vote their own choice, but the winning candidates were already picked by the Japanese. Filipinos continued to fight the Japanese for 3 brutal years. Eventually, through the combined might of US and Filipino forces, the Philippines would be liberated from the Japanese in August 1945. The plan for independence was kept and the Philippines officially became independent on July 4, 1946. The voting rights in the 1935 Constitution were restored. The Third Republic would continue for a few decades, but as time went on, many political leaders agreed that more reform was needed. The 1935 Constitution, which was written during the American period, should be replaced by a new constitution that would implement big changes in the entire government. In 1971, a constitutional convention was held, and they began writing a new constitution. As this was happening, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. was rising to power. In 1965, he won the presidential election, and in 1969, he won re-election. During the first years of his presidency, there was an atmosphere of optimism. But by 1970, the economy began to slow down and poverty began to rise. Marcos Sr.'s presidency was legally required to end in 1973, but that did not happen. On September 21, 1972, Marcos issued Proclamation 1081 declaring martial law over the entire country. The Constitutional Convention submitted the draft constitution to President Marcos. In December, he issued Presidential Decree No. 86. This created the citizen assemblies that were used to approve the new constitution. The decree outlined those who were able to vote in these assemblies. 1. That they were a resident of the barrio for at least 6 months. 2. That they were at least 15 years old. And 3. That they were a Filipino citizen. And 4. That they were registered in the barrio. There were many problems that arose with the votes of the citizen assemblies. Legally, this was not the proper way to amend the Constitution. A national plebiscite of secret ballot votes was the proper way. Besides that, not every barrio or barangay was able to vote. There's extensive evidence of barrios not voting at all. The secret ballot was replaced with a vote through a show of hands in front of the entire assembly. This allowed the use of intimidation if they did not raise their hands. Third, there were instances where votes against the Constitution were not counted at all. There were many more issues with the voting, but in the end, Marcos declared that the new Constitution was overwhelmingly ratified by the citizen assemblies. Martial law would continue, and Marcos Sr. would remain in power. The newly approved 1973 Constitution outlined further progress in voting rights of Filipinos. It was no longer necessary to be able to read and write in order to have the right to vote. The voting age was also at 18 years old. However, this was not followed. Marcos kept the citizen assemblies and the voting age there was kept at 15 years old. They were used to pass amendments during the early years of martial law. This included questions on whether martial law should continue or whether Marcos should remain president. While the Constitution said that voting was only for those 18 years old and above, those under 18 could vote for new positions. In 1975, Marcos Sr. created the Kabataang Barangay. The KB was composed of 6 members and 1 leader who was also a member of the Barangay Council. They were voted on by voters who were 15 to 17 years old. This was the origin of the present Sangguniang Kabataan, or SK. The requirements in the 1973 Constitution did not really come into play in the early years of martial law. They only became evident starting with the contested elections in 1978. As time went on, Marcos would begin to lose his grip on power. In 1981, he would proclaim the end of martial law. However, more and more Filipinos continued to turn against him. The situation ignited in 1983 with the assassination of Benigno Aquino Jr., Marcos's foremost political rival. This was followed by the EDSA Revolution in 1986. It resulted with Marcos's fall and his exile to Hawaii. With the fall of Ferdinand Marcos, democratic rule was restored. The 1973 Constitution was replaced by a revolutionary government under the Freedom Constitution. That constitution was eventually replaced by the 1987 Constitution, the constitution that we still use to this day. The 1987 Constitution kept most of the parts about voting from the 1973 Constitution, but introduced a second section. This section mentioned that a law should be passed to allow absentee voting for qualified Filipinos. This means that they do not have to be in the country to vote. Eventually, a law was passed to allow this, called the Overseas Voting Act of 2003. This allowed many Filipinos outside the country, including many OFWs, or overseas Filipino workers, to vote while helping the country's economy. We must remember that our right to vote must never be taken for granted. It is a right that many suffered for and that many died for. It started as a vote limited to a few rich men to elect a few local positions into the right that we all enjoy now. A vote open to all adults to vote from the lowest local position to the highest authority in the land, the president. It is a right that we earned as a democratic society. However, we must also remember that our vote is not just a right but also a responsibility. As many of us go to vote, let us think carefully on who we will vote for and choose candidates that will help the country, not hurt it.